This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Verso Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. Looking to read more radical books this year? The Verso Book Club is a monthly subscription that gets you every single ebook that Verso publishes each month, plus one or more print books in the mail. If you join in January, you'll choose between Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis by John Nichols, a furious denunciation of America's coronavirus criminals, and Britain's Empire, Resistance, Repression, and Revolt by Richard Gott, a magisterial history of the foundation of the British Empire, and the forgotten story of resistance to its formation. And if you join at the comrade level, you'll also get Culture and Politics, Class, Writing, Socialism by Raymond Williams, and Imperium, Structures and Affects of Political Bodies by Frédéric Lordon. If you're a book club member, you also get 50% off everything on the Verso site as long as you subscribe. Check out the Verso Book Club's monthly picks at versobooks.com. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Daniel Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Russians are not the only people subjected to propaganda about the crisis in Ukraine. In the mainstream U.S. press, the bias is more subtle and perhaps largely unintentional. Many American reporters covering the crisis reflexively take on the viewpoint of American empire. Not because anyone orders them to do so, but rather because deeply rooted ideology makes such a viewpoint appear to be normal and objective, even to the very people who are actively constructing it. The American press should cover Russia and Putin skeptically. There is obviously quite a lot to be skeptical about. But good journalism would apply that very same skeptical frame to the U.S. and to NATO and to their motivations. A Russian invasion of Ukraine would be really bad for the world and for Ukraine in particular. But is an invasion even likely? The Ukrainian government doesn't seem to think so. A lot is lost in this coverage that always frames Putin as the aggressor and the U.S. and NATO as being forced by Putin to react defensively, including the long history of post-Soviet NATO expansion and other actions taken by the U.S. in making today's post-Soviet crises. Often, our coverage seems a lot like Russian state media, just in reverse. Also lost in this coverage are Ukraine and Ukrainians, what they think about what's going on and what they want for their country, and how the country's history over the past 3 decades has led us to this moment. Today, my guest is Ukrainian sociologist Volodymyr Ishchenko. His work, which I will link to in the show notes, is really quite brilliant. Before we get started, I want to signpost a bit of recent Ukrainian history that we discuss so that you don't get lost if you haven't been following that history closely. President Viktor Yanukovych had been pursuing an association agreement with the European Union. Under Russian pressure, Yanukovych pulled away from that agreement in November 2013, sparking protests. In December 2013, the protests grew in number after a violent police crackdown and forced Yanukovych to flee the country. The result was a secessionist uprising in the eastern Donbass region, backed by Russia, and Russia's seizure and annexation of Crimea. The conflict in Donbass continues today, with more than 13,000 dead. We get into a lot more detail in the interview, but those are some important historical events you need as context. I also want to thank Sophie Pinkham and Tony Wood for suggesting that I reach out to Volodymyr. And if you want more of the history of Russia that we touch on in this interview, I recommend that you listen to my interview with Tony Wood, and I will post a link to that in the show notes as well. We have so many great interviews coming up. Next week is Femi Taiwo hosting an interview with Dongo Sambasila and Daniela Gabor on the centrality of monetary policy in colonial and neocolonial domination, particularly in West Africa. That was going to be this week, but I bumped it for today's Ukraine episode. We've also got, in no particular order because I don't know quite when anything will be released, Raj Patel and Rupa Marya on Inflamed Deep Medicine and the Anatomy of Injustice, Veronica Gago on Argentine Feminism and Neoliberalism from Below, Kim Phillips-Fine on Invisible Hands, the businessman's crusade against the New Deal, Gio Mar and Mariam Kaba on police, Destin Jenkins on the bonds of inequality, debt and the making of the American city, Brenna Bandar on the colonial lives of property, and so much more after that. If you depend on The Dig for these sorts of in-depth interviews on politics, economics, and history all over the world, please take a quick moment to make a contribution at patreon.com/thedig. This podcast is overwhelmingly a listener-supported one. It's the reason I can do this for a living and pay everyone who helps put these episodes out, and it's why we don't have to paywall any of our episodes to raise money, because those of you who can afford to contribute do so. We also have books, coffee mugs, and tote bags to send you in the mail. That's patreon.com/thedig. Please make a contribution if you can. You also get our weekly newsletter by email if you make a contribution, which is really, really good. Okay, here's Volodymyr Ishchenko. Volodymyr Ishchenko is a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at the Free University in Berlin. His research focuses on protests and social movements, revolutions, radical right and left politics, nationalism, and civil society. His work and interviews on contemporary Ukrainian politics, the Euromaidan uprising, and the following war in 2013-14 have been published in Post-Soviet Affairs, Globalizations, New Left Review, The Guardian, and Jacobin. He is working on a collective book manuscript, The Maidan Uprising, Mobilization, Radicalization, and Revolution in Ukraine, 2013-2014. And please do pardon my mispronunciation of all things Ukrainian. Volodymyr Ishchenko, welcome to The Dig.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening.
Is Russia preparing to invade Ukraine, or is the West hyping the prospect of an invasion for its own purposes? What are Putin's possible aims? What are those of the United States and the EU? What, in short, is going on right now?
Look, I really hate these speculations, and there have been a lot of them at least in the last 3 months, but even longer, of course. And many people turned into Putin experts, and there are other people who have their cliches about the US policies. I mean, I'm skeptical to any kind of like cliche style and one factor explanation for what's going on. And at least I would say that there are at least two autonomous processes. One thing is what Russia is doing, is what they're really doing, and with moving their military and with stating these demands to the NATO, and that's partially the fact. But there is also another autonomous process, is the perception and media representation and the official representation in the Western countries, primarily in the US, in the UK, and the kind of like a different representations in Germany, France, and other European Union countries. And it may seem like the US may be reacting to what Russia is doing and saying that it's going to be an imminent invasion and so on, but it's more like independent from that, and we should analyze both what's going on from the Russian side, but we should also keep very critical distance from what the US official says, what the CIA is so generously feeding to the media. Starting from 3 months ago, when there were no evidence signs that anything like very soon invasion is prepared by Russia, and their media of public and covered actions that may actually contribute to the escalation. So what is becoming kind of more known right now is that actually Ukrainian government doesn't really take it so seriously for the prospects for the invasion in the very near future. I mean, in the course of the 2 or 3 weeks, as it is very explicitly stated by the top officials in the US and just very recently by Boris Johnson, very directly saying within the same narrative, and which is skeptically taken by Germany, by France, which are kind of supposedly looking at the same data that CIA provides them, but saying that no, we are not seeing any signs of what you are telling us is going on. And the Ukrainian officials in the Ministry of Defense, at the Security Council, they say basically they almost explicitly allude that the United States is using this media scare for their domestic and geopolitical purposes. They are very vague because it's super important partner for Ukraine right now, and they're not ready to accuse them in very direct words. But what we can read from their interviews, from their statements, it's basically this, that the United States are kind of exploiting this story. And as I said, it's at least partially independent from the real actions from the Russian side. And it's not only the Ukrainian government, it's also the independent analysts. Just recently, the Center for Defense Strategies, this is a think tank, Ukrainian think tank, which is headed by the former Minister of Defense, published a report where they say that they regard very unlikely any large-scale invasion from Russia to Ukraine with occupation of large territories, with occupation of the big cities in the course of the next several weeks. But also they think it's very unlikely that they may do this in the course of 2022 until the end of the year. So they believe it's much more probable that Russia may use so-called hybrid attacks, attacking the infrastructure, attacking maybe cyber attacks, and at the very most, they may do kind of a targeted strikes. But they don't really see the preparations for a really large-scale invasion. Those 100,000 or whatever soldiers they amassed at the Ukrainian borders, at least as we are told, it's really looks like far below the number of the military that would be required to attack such big country as Ukraine. And Ukrainian military is at least 200,000, and actually even more if we count all other institutions and all other units that also have access to the arms, and so on. So, yeah, that's at least we need to keep in mind that yes, Russia is doing something, and they may respond if they won't be satisfied by the NATO response to their demands. But their response not necessarily will be targeted on Ukraine. And even if on Ukraine, it's not necessarily and probably very unlikely that it will be in that form of the large-scale attack and occupation, because then there would be different consequences. And as the report from the Center of Defense Strategies basically says, it would be simply suicidal for Putin. Even if they attack and occupy Ukraine, even if they would ready really to amass enough forces in a short time for this, then what are they going to do with this? How would it even solve their problems, and how are they going to solve the new problems that would arise for Russian geopolitical situation, for Russian economy, for Russian government capacity to keep the revolting population in Ukraine? So there would be many questions and many problems with this.
So I know this may require speculation, but what do you see as being the potential U.S. and EU and NATO interest in hyping the prospect of an invasion? And then what is Russia's interest in contributing to the sense of impending crisis on its end?
you're completely right. These are speculations, and I've read many versions of the speculations. So some people connect it to domestic processes in the United States, the results of defeat in Afghanistan, and the declining support for Biden, and the midterm elections that would come not very far from this point. So it's been quite often. This happened quite often when the politicians are in the domestic trouble. The foreign policy escalation is one of the tools they may try to solve these troubles in the domestic politics. At some point, there might be reasons for a Ukrainian attack on Donbass, although like many people say that it would be suicidal for Ukraine because Russia just overwhelms Ukrainian army, and in case they would try to get back Donbass by force, repeating what's been known as kind of like a Georgian scenario or South Ossetian scenario, so repeating the attack by Georgian President Saakashvili in 2008 on the separatist region South Ossetia, which ended in a 5 days war when the Russian army easily defeated the Georgians. And this is seriously discussed now in the Russian expert circles that it would be probably not bad to repeat this scenario in case of now to punish Ukraine and to force them to even more concessions, kind of like Minsk III peace accords. I mean, from the constellation in Ukrainian domestic politics, at the moment it would be not really likely because then the consequences of this defeat would be put on Zelensky, and even now he feels like not very secure in his office, antagonizing many different powerful players in Ukrainian politics, and also as we are getting some information that the Democrats in the United States are not really fond of Zelensky right now. So that would be risky. However, in case of even deeper troubles, these people may consider this because anyway, the escalation of the war, it helps to unite a part of the public around the government. Although that would be not really a smart move. And for some people in the media, they explicitly say that creating from Ukraine another Afghanistan for Russia, it's not really bad. So why not invite Russians into Ukraine and push them to the quite severe political, economic, and other consequences? That it's not necessarily that they would be able to survive. So that's at least part of the reason. And there are also like the reasons why the United Kingdom, the Boris Johnson is now super active in this process and trying to turn Britain into a player in the Eastern European politics with these allegations about alliance, Britain, Poland, Ukraine, some people even named Turkey in this place. And this may be what stands behind that very mysterious and ridiculous press release that UK Foreign Office recently published about like pro-Russian government headed by Yevgeny Murayev, who is actually not a pro-Russian politician, and which was met with a lot of laughter among very different circles in Ukrainian public. So these are the reasons, and France and Germany are not that fond about escalating with Russia and taking much more careful position and not really buying to the narrative of the imminent invasion that we just need to do everything possible to stop it.
What about Russia's motivation? I think in recent weeks are probably the first time I've ever read the words NATO expansion in the mainstream American press because Putin put those demands on the table and the press finally had to report that as an issue of concern to Russia. And do you think that stopping NATO expansion is Russia's primary motivation for the actions that it's taking to escalate the present crisis, or does it have to do with Russian domestic politics, or both, or something else entirely?
I mean, one of the puzzles is that actually if they would really risk to go into the major invasion to Ukraine, the Russian public won't really like it. And that's what we clearly see from the polls. And the annexation of Crimea was like almost bloodless. The intervention into Syrian war also didn't bring serious casualties to Russian military. The operation in Kazakhstan was just very short, like practically bloodless. So these were huge successes for Russia, and these were the moves which achieved their goals without really that much of consequences, even if we consider the international sanctions after Crimean annexation. So the attack on Ukraine, and especially ground troops attack that would bring like many casualties to the Russian army, from what we know about the moods of the Russian public, that won't be taken enthusiastically, to say the least. So for Russia, they may use this opportunity to escalate, to press on the maximal demands, and probably they would get something from this only with the threat of invasion, but not really going far enough. And what they are getting right now is NATO and United States are ready to talk with them, at least about some of the regulation for the military trainings in close proximity, about the location of the troops and rockets. This is important. Probably they won't give a very clear, ultimative rejection of Ukraine's prospects to NATO, but there is no consensus on taking NATO into the alliance in any case. And one of the results of Russian actions is actually increasing the discord among NATO, and this is also positive for Russia. And so if they would be able to increase the tensions between Germany and the United States, and France would be also on the side of Germany, that's great. That's not really bad. So that's the things that Putin is capable to win right now. On the other side, if the target of media narrative about the imminent invasion is actually Germany, and with the goal of pushing them to be more harsh on the Nord Stream, that's one of the risks.
That's the gas pipeline being built from Russia to Germany.
Yeah, that is it is built, but it is not certified, and there are certain bureaucratic technical issues with the certification, and now the ball is on the German side, actually. And so if this discussion of the imminent invasion, sanctions, and so on and so forth would undermine the Nord Stream, then Putin would be not in a great balance as a result of what's going on. But he might have some of the motivations.
Stepping back a bit in history for listeners who aren't familiar, why did the U.S. and European powers pursue NATO expansion after the Soviet Union's collapse, given that NATO's reason for existing no longer existed, and that Russia at the time was really rather subservient to the United States? At one point, Russia even thought it could join NATO, but that's of course not how things worked out. Instead, NATO expanded eastward, and Russia often describes feeling encircled, which I can only imagine how Americans would react to a Russian or any sort of hostile foreign military alliance extending out to Canada and Mexico.
That's a great question, and as I understand, I'm not a historian of NATO and of this period, so I just may say what sounds to me as convincing explanation, and part of it is that the states didn't care that much about Russia, and they actually believe that Russia is going to be in decline, and they may do whatever they want in the Eastern Europe. So the Eastern Europe were seen as a path to Europe, and at the same time as a defense from possible Russian actions. So they had very long-term historical grievances against Russia, and NATO were perceived by them as a security shield. Did those people in the States and in other Western European countries consider that expanding NATO, they are actually making NATO less effective mechanism of security, because now they're seriously discussing, are they going to fight with Russia in case they would attack Baltic states? Do they really care about Baltic states? And that it means, and if not, it means that the goal, it supposedly exists: security, protecting everyone. And these are the questions which are, for some reason, they are voiced, or at least prominently voiced, only in the recent years. I recall this discussion started only after 2014, after Crimean annexation and after escalation of the relations with Russia. But why they didn't think about this in the 90s, when they expanded up to small Baltic states they don't really care about? That's a big mystery for me. Some people think that they were just too enthusiastic about what's going on and too self-confident about the imminent Russian decline. And then the story about Ukraine and Georgia, which were actually pushed, I mean, not really pushed, but actively invited by George W. Bush, and which resulted in that infamous decision by Bucharest summit in 2008, when they decided that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of NATO without giving them the membership action plan and without specifying in what time period they would eventually become members of NATO, because of the position of Germany and France, which were thinking about that Russia has been voicing their concerns about NATO expansion since 1990s. And perhaps Ukraine and Georgia are way too far for this. So this event should be probably seen in the context of other George W. Bush expansionist actions that ended in the war in Afghanistan, in the war in Iraq, and that was the person who was pushing for expanding the American interests in this part of the world.
Where do Ukrainians and the Ukrainian government fit into all of this? Because, as you mentioned earlier, rather inconveniently, the Ukrainian government is nowhere near as exercised about the prospect of a Russian invasion as the U.S. and the American media are. And it just really seems like the conflict is about Ukraine, but it often doesn't seem to involve Ukraine or Ukrainians as active participants.
Yeah, that's kind of that's a very sad reality. And it's the deterioration of Ukrainian sovereignty, especially after 2014, and when Ukraine became more and more dependent in military, economically, politically on the United States, partially on the European states as well. And now they are talking about Ukraine very often without Ukraine, and Ukrainian government is actually insisting on this formula, like we should discuss Ukraine only together with us. However, in reality, what we see are direct negotiations between the United States and Russia about Ukraine, where Ukraine is not really present. And the biggest problem is actually that to which extent the Ukrainian government, which says that, of course, we want to get into NATO, and why are we not in NATO already, as the President Zelensky asked Biden last year very directly, why Ukraine is not a member of NATO. But this question is not really asked to Ukrainians. When they decided in Bucharest that Ukraine will become a part of NATO, support for joining NATO in Ukraine was below 20%. And most of Ukrainians were split about keeping the neutral status as it was inscribed into the foundational documents of the Ukrainian state, into the constitution, into the Declaration of Sovereignty. Ukraine is a non-bloc country, meaning it doesn't join any military alliances. So when George W. Bush was pushing for this, and when moderately nationalist pro-Western President Yushchenko was also kind of like applying for NATO membership, they didn't really ask Ukrainians. And yeah, I didn't mention that most of Ukrainians were split between the supporters of neutrality and supporters of joining a military alliance with Russia, the CSTO. This very low level of support, it was more or less the same, about 20% or even lower, until the Euromaidan revolution and until the following events in Crimea, in Donbass, where part of Ukrainians started to see Russia as a real threat and NATO as the security mechanism against Russia. So at that moment, support for NATO increased up to about 40%. But 40%, it's not a majority. And this level of support of about 45%, according to some polls, was fluctuating until 2019. And this was an amazing phenomenon in the Ukrainian public mood, because even after years of the war with Russia, a large part of Ukrainians were not really ready to embrace NATO, because they saw NATO as perhaps as another institution that would decline in Ukrainian sovereignty. They were scared that joining NATO would mean dragging Ukraine into American wars. And they didn't want to join NATO because of possible increase of tensions with Russia. So Ukraine would become less secure in NATO. And because of the tensions among Ukrainians themselves. So there are many rational reasons that we know from the studies that try to measure the factors of support for NATO in Ukraine. And in 2019, Zelensky is elected as a president. He was super popular and he campaigned for NATO. And he was able to detoxify the issue of NATO from Ukrainian nationalist issues, which by the previous president Poroshenko, they were more like connected. Poroshenko was pushing forward the nationalization policies, and at the same time he pushed through the parliament a decision to change Ukrainian constitution and to inscribe there the orientation to Euro-Atlantic integration instead of the non-bloc status. So in Ukrainian constitution now it says that Ukraine is heading towards NATO, although it may probably never turn into a real NATO member. That's an irony of the situation. And another reason for recent increase of pro-NATO support is, of course, Russian buildups last year, which scares a significant part of Ukrainian public. But whether these factors would stay and whether we would see a stable majority for NATO in Ukraine at the moment, that's a big question, because Zelensky is not that popular anymore and he's losing his popularity. And the crisis would be over at some moment, and probably with some concessions from the United States and NATO that may be seen by a part of Ukrainians as betrayal. And some people won't be so scared anymore as they may be now. So it may happen that in the next year or in the next 2 years we may see the decline of NATO support, because NATO support is still quite highly correlating with the understanding of by Ukrainians of their own national identity, and that there are very significant differences between Western and Central regions on the one side and Eastern and Southern regions on the other side. And in East and South, support for neutrality may be even higher than support for NATO. And a really stable, overwhelming majority in support for NATO exists only in the Western regions of Ukraine.
One thing that really jumps out to me, you mentioned this irony of Ukraine's official intention to join NATO, even though it'll likely never happen, is that the U.S. refuses to negotiate limiting NATO expansion with Russia, and yet also makes it clear that it will not take direct military action in case of a Russian invasion to defend Ukraine against Russia. So on the surface level, the U.S. and NATO posture is about solidarity with Ukraine. But given that they will neither negotiate to defend Ukraine from Russian invasion, nor militarily defend Ukraine against a Russian invasion, it seems pretty clear that some other principle that has nothing in particular to do with solidarity with Ukraine is guiding their approach.
I mean, yes, that's, the American foreign policy is quite cynical sometimes. On the one side, of course, we might say, who would want a nuclear war? Or even a real chance of the war between the nuclear states. That would mean direct support for Ukraine and sending the troops to Ukraine and so on and so forth. On the other side, supporting without real military intervention in Ukraine is also beneficial for the United States. They may send the weapons there. They may turn Ukraine into a big problem for Russia. There are reports that CIA was training Ukrainian paramilitaries that would play a role in anti-Russian resistance. Now many countries are sending weapons there. And a new war would be also the new profits for the weapons industry. And so there are many benefits that may be won with Russia invited to attack Ukraine and stuck there.
Yeah, like you mentioned earlier, that some in the U.S. national security and European national security states might see an Afghanistan for Russia, a second Afghanistan for Russia, as a positive thing, which says something about how the U.S. and West generally regard Afghans and, I suppose, Ukrainians as well.
Yeah, it's quite possible, but although we don't know how prominent is this opinion among the real decision makers.
I want to delve into the more recent history that led up to the present crisis, beginning with the Euromaidan revolution of 2014. You write, quote, "As the story goes, in 2014, Ukrainians from different regions, which merged into one modern state only during World War II, finally truly united in the civic inclusive nation born in the revolution. Ukrainians made their civilizational choice in favor of the Western geopolitical orientation and are defending it against Russian aggression, which is attempting to return Ukraine to its sphere of influence. The war in Donbass that followed in 2014 is presented as primarily an interstate war and not a direct continuation of the violent civil conflict that started in the last days of Euromaidan, even before any military moves by Russia." There's a lot to unpack in your analysis here, so I want to take it piece by piece. First, what was the Euromaidan revolution about? In particular, what did Europe mean to Euromaidan protesters in 2014? What did it mean to the protest's opponents? And how did the question of Europe versus Russia become so central to it?
Europe was a trigger, specifically the European Association Agreement that Ukrainian President Yanukovych was for some time seemingly ready to sign, but in the very last moment, he decided that the economic costs of that Russians actually were threatening Ukraine with, and not just threatening, but they started kind of like a trade war in 2013. So they were very serious about pushing Ukraine rather to join the Eurasian, or what at that moment it was called simply customs union with Russia, Belarus, and Kazakhstan, and keeping them away from the orientation towards EU. And EU at that moment was denying any possibility of the tripartite negotiations. It would include Russia, Ukraine, and Europe. And when Russia was saying that if you want to sign the free trade zone agreement, and because the association agreement was primarily about a free trade zone between EU and Ukraine, and that would, of course, had an impact for the trade between Russia and Ukraine. So Russian position at that moment was that, okay, let's decide it in tripartite negotiations. And the EU was saying something like what the United States and NATO are saying now. So that these are exclusive relations between European Union and Ukraine, and there is no voice for Russia in these relations. So the escalation of tensions and analysis of the economic consequences particularly for Ukrainian most advanced parts of economy that were primarily the still Soviet industries, not be that competitive anymore in the free trade zone, and the demands that were attached to this European Association Agreement, particularly from IMF, about increasing the prices for public utilities, a hugely sensitive question for the majority of the population that would have an impact for the prospects for Yanukovych re-elections. So they pushed Yanukovych to stop very suddenly, very unexpectedly, and that was a trigger by the liberal civil society to start the Euromaidan protests. Maidan means basically the central square. This is how the central square in Kyiv is also called Independence Maidan. And this was a square where two previous revolutions also took place in 1990 and in 2004. And then they started the Euromaidan protests, which were not that big until the quite harsh repression, attack on the protesters' camp with quite many people injured by the riot police, very unexpectedly, and we still don't really understand in full who actually ordered that attack. There are conspiracy theories that Yanukovych didn't even know about this attack because it was so counterproductive for the escalation of the events that followed that it would be a very dumb move to do this, and maybe he was set up either by his some of his employees, parts of his team. There are different people who are named for this. So in any case, relatively small and peaceful protests escalated into uprising, and then it turned into much more different things than just Europe. From the beginning, Europe was seen as a kind of like a civilizational choice, as you quoted from my article. But this vision of the civilizational choice was probably the vision only from one part of the protesters, not necessarily even the majority. This was the narrative of the NGO civil society, supported by the Western donors and middle-class people, English-speaking, good connections with the embassies, often with the Western university degrees and so on. For other people, especially when the uprising escalated, they were putting their diverse grievances. And this is actually a very general problem of the many contemporary revolutions that bring many people to the streets However, these massive mobilizations, which sometimes even end into toppling of the government, they do not lead to any systemic change. And the problem starts even with articulating those programs for systemic change and creating the institutions, the political organizations that would lead towards those systemic change. So that's why we're actually seeing like a huge number of the revolutions, and some scholars, as Mark Basinger, for example, in his forthcoming book, he's calculating the number of revolutions which actually increased in the recent years. But we see a lot of revolutions without any major institutional revolutionary change that follow them.
You describe Euromaidan as, quote, a deficient revolution. Along with your colleague Oleg Zhavlov, you write, quote, revolutions have been plentiful in post-Soviet countries, but unlike classic revolutionary examples, they have been remarkably consistent in failing to establish a more stable political order and states autonomous from the influence of patronage. Post-revolutionary leaders and parties have either quickly lost power or had significant problems with re-election. Institutional and structural changes have remained limited. It has become typical in these countries to view these revolutions as just another cycle of elite circulation that changed nothing. What then explains, as you write, quote, this pattern of frequent but ineffective revolutions that have periodically swept not only Ukraine, both in 2014 and in 2004 with the Orange Revolution, but also Kyrgyzstan, Armenia, Georgia, Moldova?
Yeah, together with Oleg, we are trying to generalize the analysis of Ukrainian Maidans, and we think that it would make sense to speak about Maidan revolutions in general, not necessarily only in relation to Ukraine, but also at least to other post-Soviet states and maybe to other states as well. And what we mean by Maidan revolutions is it's a deficient revolution, and it is a deficient revolution because it combines the revolutionary repertoire of action, massive mobilization, sometimes assaulting the buildings, using unarmed violence, sometimes using even armed violence. And we've just seen in Kazakhstan that revolution may escalate into very violent actions very quickly now. In contrast for example, to the pattern of 1989 revolutions that mostly went very non-violent. Now we see the increased violence. So these are radical violent mobilizations, but which at the same time, they are paralleled only with very poorly articulated claims. The people are, for example, are saying something that we are for Europe, civilizational choice. Very often they use this very vague moralistic language, revolution of dignity, freedom, honesty, and so on and so forth, which is very vague and which translate into specific programs not really well. I mean, there are people who would start later to exploit this revolutionary legitimacy in order to push for their very specific programs, which may not really represent the majority of participants. So vaguely articulated claims, very loosely organized. Many revolutions were diverse, like classical French or Russian Revolution, where they were also like cross-class coalitions, in fact. However, there were also powerful leaders within those revolutions that were really, they were real political representatives of the masses of workers, peasants, and they were really capable to speak on behalf of them and to push forward the urgent, imminent interests of the broad social classes. However, not anymore. So we see also very diverse coalitions, but they are very also loosely organized, and that means again a possibility for hijacking the revolution. And finally, the leaders of the Maidan revolutions are also quite weak. They, if you speak, for example, about Euromaidan, those political party leaders from the opposition to Yanukovych, they were mistrusted and ridiculed by many supporters at Maidan Square. They were not seen as leaders. And that means a possibility for the situational leadership. For example, at the moment of escalation, prepared radical nationalists may come in at the critical moment, escalate the fights with the police, and now lead, at least situationally, at least for some time, the violent development of the revolution, as it happened during Euromaidan. So these deficient revolutions, they produce a revolutionary legitimacy after which afterwards may be exploited by various political forces appealing to this legitimacy and pushing forward their often quite unpopular agendas. So what happened in Euromaidan is that the people who protested not for joining NATO, and there were like specific like leaflets, like people in the East, we are not going to impose Ukrainian language on you. We are not against Russian language. We are not for NATO. We are not even for EU. We are just fed up with Yanukovych. We want decent jobs. We want decent wages, and so on and so forth. So this would be a feeling that would appeal to many protesters on the Kiev streets. But what happened afterwards, the various forces were exploiting the outcomes of the revolution, pushing it directly to the nationalization policies, to attacking the use of Russian language in public sphere, for NATO, as we see right now, and for other neoliberal and nationalist policies that were not exactly those things that the majority of protesters would prefer to see. And we see this pattern in many other post-Soviet revolutions. We see them happening in many places, and we see them more and more frequently. So, and that's another consequences of them. They are not creating strong, stable political regimes. As, for example, the result of the Russian Revolution, the political regime that lasted for over 70 years. It's like Sida Skocpol from her super classical work. She argued that the result of the revolution was a stronger state. This was about the classical social revolution. The result of contemporary Maidan revolutions is actually a weaker state, which is why we see an escalation of these revolutions. Ukraine have seen 3 revolutions in the life of just one generation, and quicker and quicker and quicker. We've seen 3 revolutions in Kyrgyzstan, Central Asian Republic. Recently, a revolution in Kazakhstan, uprising in Kazakhstan, which was again kind of like overtaken by an elite struggle, as far as I understand what's going on right now. A revolution in Armenia, a revolution in Georgia, attempts for similar protests in Belarus. And so we see this shaking of the political regimes, and the resulting institutions are not actually stronger. They are not more representative. They are not capable to win a broad legitimacy of the masses. And this creates the grounds of even more revolutions. And at some point, this escalating organic crisis, if we were to use a Gramscian term, then it would lead may lead to quite disastrous results. And one of the consequences is particularly the escalation of nationalism, because if the post-revolutionary governments cannot deliver in decent wages, in decent jobs, escalating nationalist tensions is one of the ways to compensate for the deficiency of revolutionary outcomes. And so we've got a war and escalation of nationalist policies in Ukraine. We've got a war between Armenia and Azerbaijan that followed the Armenian revolutions. We've got military conflict between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan right after another one, Kyrgyz revolution. and so on and so forth. So that this may be also, the classical example is what I mentioned, the attempt by Georgia to regain South Ossetia, also led by post-revolutionary president. So this may be a general pattern and a way to compensate for the deficiency of the revolutions, which at the same time reproduce and escalate the crisis of representation even more.
Well, yeah, about that crisis of representation, you write that what's driving these Maidan revolutions is a persistent crisis of representation across the post-Soviet world. Why is it proven impossible to achieve any sort of post-Soviet hegemony? What are these revolutions attempting to break free of, and why do they end up back in the same place?
Many people actually speak about the crisis of representation or organic crisis in many parts of the world, that the people
right here in the United States.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. That people don't trust, less and less trust the government, less and less trust democratic institutions, they less participate in politics, and so on and so forth. So you understand, but what we are living through in the post-Soviet countries is actually the crisis of hegemony, or the crisis of political representation that has its roots even in the 60s, in the end of the 60s, when the Communist Party was not being able anymore to claim leadership and in the progressive modernization of the Soviet Union, and it started to be perceived as a parasitic elite, as the people who are not able to push forward our country, and which was becoming less and less capable to reach the technological and consumer levels of the capitalist countries. It was competing with very directly, and this was like the very important part of the official rhetoric. And we were the people in the Soviet Union were supposed to live better and better. However, the lives were stagnating, and that was a part of the factor for the massive disappointment in the Communist Party. But it also was not able to integrate the activization in the 60s, which had its peak in the Prague Spring in 1968, but there were like similar processes in the Soviet Union. Many young people enthusiastic actually about communism, but meeting a conservative reaction from the communist nomenclatura. And Gorbachev was trying to modernize the Soviet Union, but still keeping the socialist foundations of the Soviet Union state. He failed. And what happened afterwards was a chaotic disintegration of the elite. This elite, this post-Soviet elite, which was emerging very quickly in the end of the 80s, in the beginning of the 90s, they emerged in the process of chaotic privatization of the state property, which has been widely seen until this moment as basically a theft of the property created by the sacrifices and by the work of the millions of Soviet people. And we see still...
It was a moment of primitive accumulation.
Exactly, yeah. But that... in case of Western Europe, that moment was actually, it was not a moment, it was like decades and centuries of primitive accumulation. In the beginning of the post-Soviet period, it happened during weeks and months, at most years. And also the difference with the classical primitive accumulation at the dawn of capitalism, that there were no ideological, religious, traditional legitimation for big property, especially the big property taken from the people, from the state, and privatized. So this elite was seen as extremely illegitimate from the very start. It's not that they had a kind of like hegemony, had legitimacy earlier, but then lost it. That's the process probably that maybe may describe the processes in the United States or in Western Europe. That from the very start, these oligarchs, this Putin's, Lukashenko's, Yanukovych's, they didn't have that much of the really active consent for their rule. And these post-Soviet elites, they were not able to solve this crisis of legitimacy, crisis of representation. And this is the basic background factor for the post-Soviet revolutions. And for the instability of political regimes in post-Soviet space that maybe only temporarily stabilized via what Gramsci called Caesarism, or like usually in Marxism called Bonapartism. Not really a hegemonic rule, but the rule which primarily is based on balancing some interests and coercion of other interests. And Putin, Lukashenko are probably the best examples of this post-Soviet Caesarism. And in case of Ukraine, it was, for various reasons, it was continuously failing. We've seen only one of Ukrainian presidents was capable to get re-elected for the second term. It was Leonid Kuchma. And so we've seen actually 6 presidents and like dozens of changing governments during the 30 years of Ukraine's independence, and that's a very quite a good measure for the severity of organic crisis and incapacity of elites even to unite among themselves and to create any stable structure that would, like, potentially afterwards we would be able to claim a broad representation within the society.
What about Russia and China and various anti-imperialist leftists all over the place who frame these so-called color revolutions as a Western conspiracy? What do you make of that argument? Is it a vulgar and reductive anti-imperialism that fails to take account of a lot of complexity in domestic reality, and or does it also get at some truths?
I mean, that's it's both, of course. Surely it's a way to delegitimize the revolutions and to claim that there are no legitimate concerns that drive people to the streets. Of course, there are legitimate concerns. There are other problems that even those concerns, even those grievances are not articulated, they're not organized, and so the result of the revolutions is not solution for the crisis, but kind of like escalation of that crisis. And moreover, those revolutions, they do not challenge the ruling class. At most, they drive out one of the factions, one of the patronal groups in that class. So the example of Viktor Yanukovych is very noteworthy in this respect, because Yanukovych is one of perhaps very few people in human history, one of very few rulers who was toppled twice. So he was toppled in 2004 by the Orange Revolution, one of the previous Maidans. However, just in 2 years after the Orange Revolution, he was invited as the prime minister in the post-revolutionary government. And just in 5 years, he was elected as the president. And then in 2014, he was toppled twice, the second time. And that means that you can have a revolution which changes practically nothing except of removing one group of the ruling elite, but not challenging the ruling class. And for the ruling class, it means that it's quite possible to adapt to this revolution, to join the post-revolutionary government, because it doesn't really threaten their most basic, fundamental economic interests. That's what's happening. So Putin and Lukashenko are delegitimizing Maidans because they threaten them personally, and they, of course, they are trying to present them as an issue of national security, that this is an imperialist plot, a Western plot against our countries. It's on the one side, it's a delegitimation of the revolutions. On the other side, because of the deficiency of these revolutions, what is often happens is that the West actually is getting more influence in these countries, and Ukraine is a perfect example for this.
Yeah, you write that after Euromaidan, quote, "What primarily changed was the volume of resources, financial and violent, for the narrow civil society wedge to intensify its pressure on the Ukrainian state to advance neoliberal and nationalist agendas, which, for the most part, still do not represent the interests of the macro social groups that constitute Ukrainian society. At the same time, the state became more vulnerable to pressure from civil society by becoming more dependent on foreign support, and also because its monopoly on legitimate violence was questioned during the course of the Euromaidan and war in Donbass. What is Ukrainian civil society? What constitutes it? And what do you mean by that civil society being both powerful and very narrow?"
Yeah, it's a great question, and there is really not sufficient research to study the post-Soviet civil societies, and that's actually a great topic for discussion, and not only for academic research, but for basic political strategy for progressive forces in our societies. So, why narrow? And it's not only in Ukraine; it's also in other post-Soviet countries. And in Ukraine, maybe it's not the most narrow, but still, according to the polls that are conducted every year, we see one and the same figure. The pollsters ask people, do you belong to any organization, charity, political, urban, artistic, whatever? And 80% of the people respond that I'm not a member of any of these organizations. And this figure is just almost constant for decades in Ukrainian society, despite all the revolutions that are supposed to mobilize people, to empower people. So the deficiency of revolutions is also results also in that they are not capable to create, to translate the revolutionary dynamics into creation of the stable institutions, not only in the state, but also in the civil society level. The people are temporarily mobilized, but then they are demobilized. And they are not staying part of stable organizations that would represent some specific interests of the diverse society. So, in this sense, the civil society is actually narrow, like a small minority of Ukrainian people, small but very active minority. And that's why it's powerful. Specifically after the Maidan revolutions, it's becoming more powerful because on the one side you get a weaker state undermined by the violence, undermined by the external threats, undermined by increased dependency because of the external threats. And at the same time, the nationalist segment of the civil society who got arms, who got stronger, who is organized into probably the most ideological, disciplined organizations that are capable for sustained street mobilization. So they can push by the force of their mobilization and by the ultimate threats of an armed uprising that they actually voiced in the critical, and not simply voiced, but even like showed that they are quite serious about this threat, and this is one of the reasons why Ukraine was failing to implement the Minsk peace accords, because the national civil society was explicitly threatening with violence in case the government would go for so-called capitulation, and the other.
These are the 2015 Minsk Accords, which were supposed to end the violence and the violent conflict in Donbass.
Yeah, exactly, and which didn't see significant progress since for 7 years at this moment. And the liberal and neoliberal part of the civil society organized into NGOs, think tanks, media, advocacy organizations, but not really community mobilizers. And the organizations which primarily depend on the support from Western donors, which are very professionalized, and this is like a quite narrow group of similar people with similar careers, similar understanding of the world, ideological in the very specific liberal sense, and who are capable to push on the government via the indirect route, saying to the embassies, to IMF, to foreign international organizations, which are very important for the government, that you are not implementing this list of very, very important reforms that usually technocratic, anti-corruption, neoliberal stuff, very often really hated by the people. But for this technocratic middle-class Western-sponsored people, these are their vision of the country's development. And the people who are regularly called civil society and who claim to be Ukrainian civil society, who are speaking on behalf of the civil society, very often in exactly these terms, writing some petitions with the red lines to the government, particularly against the Minsk Accords, with signatures of many liberal and nationalist organizations. And that's also another important thing, that nationalist and liberal segments are very closely interconnected with each other. And the things that would not be seen in Western countries, where liberals would be more or less separated from the nationalist segment of politics, at the moment probably seeing each other as the primary enemies in the culture wars. In Ukraine, they're holding together, and not just holding together, but also often cooperating and joining similar mobilization campaigns, and so on and so forth. And their differences about gender issues at some moment are turning not that important. And the problem is that the left segment of the civil society doesn't exist practically at the moment, particularly because of the post-Euromaidan repression. And the kind of like syndicalist segment of the civil society is quite weak. The weak trade unions, the weak social movement organizations, and the non-nationalist segment of Ukrainian politics is kind of like underdeveloped. So, and this is also the part of that crisis of hegemony of post-Soviet political elites, which were more interested in the very short-term electoral goals. And so, for example, like buying pundits, buying TV stations that would deliver quick electoral results, however, not really investing into creating the intellectual circles that would be thinking about some programmatic agendas, leading some ideological discussions, not creating like magazines, important newspapers. So something more durable that could present some alternative to the Western-sponsored civil society or the national civil society, and that's why when the government turns into quite obvious and very evident repression against oligarchic opposition politicians, as specifically escalated during the last year, and could be actually one of the factors of Russian escalation, that they've seen that the people that are kind of like more Russia-friendly, like Viktor Medvedchuk, one of the most prominent people, who is at the same time kind of like a not really a relative, but in a good friendship connection with Putin personally. And so they see that Ukrainian government just basically bans his TV stations, imposes sanctions on him personally, keeps him under the house arrest, and that the potential allies within Ukraine don't have any real chances to get into the governing coalition, and the West is just closing their eyes on what's going on. So there is a real repression against this. I don't really like to characterize them as pro-Russian, but in the Western press, they're mainly labeled as pro-Russian opposition politicians. And there is no mobilization in defense of them, although they actually are capable to gather quite significant part of Ukrainian electorate. The party that Medvedchuk was one of the leaders, at the moment when he got under Ukrainian sanctions, it was polled as the most popular party in Ukraine. So Zelensky basically closed the TV stations affiliated to the most popular opposition party and started a trial against one of the leaders of this party on the quite very dubious legal grounds.
I'm Astrid Taylor, and you're listening to The Dig with Daniel Denvir, a podcast for people who want to deeply understand the world and organize to change it. That's why you should support the show at patreon.com/thedig.
The Dig is produced in conjunction with Jacobin magazine. These are tough times for publishing, but Jacobin is sticking at it, publishing over 200 original essays every month online and producing the best socialist print magazine in the English language. Jacobin's work is just so vital in creating socialist arguments that can penetrate into the mainstream and, like Marx says, change, not just interpret, the world. But this work is dependent on your support. If you're able, please consider going to jacobinmag.com/donate and making a tax-deductible donation today. Regular monthly donations help Jacobin plan even better. That's jacobinmag.com/donate. You'll keep Jacobin going in tough times, and Jacobin will be there for you for the struggles to come. You write that, quote, Ukraine's active public since 2014 became dominated by two major segments: the liberal segment of professional think tanks, media, and advocacy organizations boosted with Western donor money, yet with little grassroots mobilization, and the radical nationalist segment that has built party organizations with the strongest, as to the low Ukrainian bar, mobilization potential, and has accumulated extraordinary paramilitary resources thanks to weakening state institutions. I want to ask about these Ukrainian nationalist forces. Some leftists outside of Ukraine, I think maybe in reaction to the simplistic mainstream romanticization of Ukrainian nationalism, portray the entirety of Ukrainian nationalism as essentially CIA-backed Nazis. Who are the nationalists, and to what extent is it accurate to reduce the broader currents of pro-European politics to right-wing and even fascist nationalism?
There are a variety of the right wing, of course. So it's just, it's not proper to call it fascist and Nazi. I mean, all the variety of currents in Ukrainian civil society. So, as I mentioned, there is a liberal segment, and these people believe about themselves as liberals. So they see the ideal development for Ukraine in kind of like becoming more and more similar to European Union and to the United States. Kind of like a liberal democratic capitalist country, and there's like a very long history of these developmentalist illusions in Eastern European intelligentsia. They've been always trying to catch up with the West and become similar to them. And we are always failing in this. And in the process of trying to catch up, we may sometimes may become even more distant from the ultimate goals. I mean, in the vision of these people. At the same time, they usually support at least moderate version of Ukrainian nationalism. And in speaking about this, I mean a vision of kind of like more Ukrainian Ukraine. A Ukraine that would try to repeat nation-building process as they imagine it happened in Western Europe in the 19th century. So basically, one language, more or less the same list of foundational historical events that are memorialized on the national level. The list, more or less, consensual list of historical heroes of Ukraine, more or less consensual narrative about Ukrainian history, the same holidays celebrated by more or less overwhelming majority in Ukraine. This nation-building project is fundamentally anti-Russian. So they define Ukraine as fundamentally the opposite of Russia. And they see Ukraine as still requiring a post-colonial emancipation from Russia. And that's why this anti-Russian fixation. It basically exists as a kind of like an ideological schema. What would be non-Russian or bad for Russia, that would be more Ukrainian or better for Ukraine. And that's a part of this, particularly of this inclination to perceive the Minsk Accords as a capitulation, because that would be in the interest of Russia too. But it's really difficult for them to think about this, that it may be better for the interest of Ukrainians as well. And that this Ukraine-Russia relations may not necessarily be a zero-sum game. And as I mentioned, there is a different vision of Ukraine within Ukrainian society. However, it's much worse organized into the active public that would articulate an alternative vision of Ukrainian national development. For example, as a neutral state that tries to keep good relations between both with EU and Russia, and try to develop as a kind of like a bridge between these powers. So the liberals, they are moderately nationalist, and this kind of like a post-colonial sentiment that's also contributes to the legitimation of their close cooperation with the more extreme nationalist currents in Ukraine, although it's just saying that this is a post-colonial condition that doesn't explain that much, particularly if you seriously look at the discussion of whether Ukraine was ever a Russian colony under the Soviet Union, when Ukraine became actually one of the most advanced parts of that state, and has never since the collapse of the Soviet Union reached that level of industrial and welfare advance. But even in the Russian Empire, it's still a contested issue, and historians have different opinions about that. And one of the arguments is that it's not that much of colonial relations, but we should probably see it more like relations between Spain and Catalonia, for example, or France and Provence, or England and Scotland. Probably would be one of the closest historical parallels. So Ukrainians were seen not as a colonized nation, very far from how, for example, the Brits saw India or African colonies, or even how Russians saw Central Asia and Siberia. in these regions, this colonial perspective has much more relevance. Then in case in Ukraine, Ukrainians were seen as the core of Russian nation, as a crucial, indispensable core that Russians cannot even imagine themselves without that. And that's actually the line of that infamous recent article by Putin, where he claimed, or the people who wrote that article for him claimed that Ukrainians and Russians are one people. And that provoked an outrage from Ukrainian nationalists that, of course, we are different people. But from the point of view of the Russian nation-building project, that's quite a typical narrative. And so the relations between Ukrainians and Russians may be seen as a competition of two nationalist projects. One of them anti-Russian Ukrainian, another one is actually a Russian nationalist project that failed to be implemented in Russian Empire because Russian Empire collapsed. And then in the Soviet Union, the discussion was not exactly that we are one people with Russians and Belarusians, but that we are three brotherly people who had very strong historical relations. However, we are distant. So we have distant languages, not just dialects of the same language as it was claimed in Russian Empire. So instead of this colonial imperialist perspective, we must see it as more like a competition of nation-building projects. One of them, particularly because of the international conjuncture, have got now more opportunities to establish itself. However, it's still failing to establish and to unite the overwhelming majority around this project. It's what we see in many of the polls and on the language, on the perception of Ukrainian history, perception of Ukrainian future. We still see very harsh divergence, and this divergence, of course, like at this moment, many people say that United States is also deeply divided between Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, and Poland is divided, and Britain is super divided between pro-Brexiters and Remainers and so on and so forth. So why Ukraine is so different? However, there is also a difference on which, about what exactly you are divided. Is it, for example, like gender issues? Is it a specific policy like Brexit? Or is it like a fundamental understanding of what is your country about, what it was, what it is, and what it is going to be? So this divides may be of different scale, and in case of Ukraine, they also like very strongly correlating with each other. That contributes to the salience of these divisions. And so that's speaking about like more broadly about the Ukrainian nationalist issues, which of course they are diverse.
In terms of far right or even fascist nationalists that wield political and military power.
Yeah, exactly. The far right and more extreme interpretations of Ukrainian nationalism that come particularly from Bandera movement, the organization of Ukrainian nationalists, which he was the leader of.
This was the Nazi allied or Nazi sympathetic.
At some point, they were collaborating with Nazis, or basically they wanted to repeat what the Croatian Ustaše were allowed to do, to create an kind of like an independent but Nazi-allied Ukrainian state. And when they proclaimed this Ukrainian state in the very first days of the German attack on the Soviet Union, the Germans were not actually happy about that, and they sent Bandera to Sachsenhausen camp. Still, his organization and the insurrectionary movement, Ukrainian Insurgent Army, which own the organization Ukrainian nationalists were kind of like a political leadership of, they got the possibility to do ethnic cleansing in Western Ukrainian lands, killing dozens of thousands of Polish peasants. They also collaborated with Nazis in the Holocaust, not as the primary agent in the Holocaust, however, is still important. And there is a groundbreaking book just recently published by John Paul Himka, a Canadian historian of Ukrainian origin, that covers specifically Ukrainian nationalists' involvement in the Holocaust. And there are organizations that derive their history tradition specifically from this extreme nationalism of Nazi allied, Nazi collaborating, like from the family of broad fascist movements that emerged in Europe in the 1930s. They derive their symbols, their ideology, they even try to model organizational forms and try to kind of continue this line in contemporary Ukrainian politics. Very serious about the paramilitary part of political movement, which now they got more opportunities to expand, organize, institutionalize, and very serious and about getting their arms. And now, because of the war, particularly, they are capable to create something that is probably unseen in any other European state. And that's Azov movement, which became quite notorious among the Western press, however, without much consequences within Ukraine. So this is an armed regiment, an official unit within the National Guard institution, armed up to the tanks, armor. And it's a political party, National Corps Party, which is a political wing of the armed far-right movement. It's a paramilitary structure affiliated both to the party and to the regiment. It's a wide infrastructure of camps, training centers, offices, summer camps for children, which became kind of like a horror show for some of the Western journalists that come there and write, yeah, here in Ukraine, Nazis are actually getting like teenagers and they teach them self-defense, armed fighting, and of course, given some of the ideological narratives there. And also that which became also quite internationally prominent and at certain point in time becoming kind of like a hub for the Western Nazis coming to Ukraine and joining Azov. In the early years of the war, they were even able to join Azov and fight in Donbass. And then this Western Nazis coming home and becoming like an object of a target of investigation and trials, as with some Americans particularly. So this is something extraordinary, and of course it's created on the one side by the conditions of the war, but also by the results of the violent revolution, which undermined the state institutions and created all these opportunities, and capturing arms, particularly in the last days of the revolution. And also by the legitimating discourses and collaboration of this liberal, moderately nationalist civil society, which sees the far right maybe sometimes too radical, sometimes, for example, like more like liberal left part of the civil society criticizes the far right. That of course with their conservative agenda, they are they kind of like useful idiots for Putin, and they give Russian propaganda the objects to discredit Ukraine, and maybe there are even some like conspiracy schemes between Russian security services and Ukrainian far right. Although Ukrainian far right, of course, they have their organic roots within Ukrainian society, and the Western powers that are quite notoriously not pushing into dealing with the people and organizations, armed organizations that may threaten Ukrainian government in implementing the international agreements that Ukraine, Germany, France, and Russia signed.
What are the far-right nationalists' vision for the Ukrainian nation beyond not being Russia? Do they share liberals' European aspirations, or are their aspirations to be more like an authoritarian political system like Russia, but just opposed to Russia? Or do their European aspirations look more like the Europe of Orban, Le Pen, and the Polish Law and Justice Party? Or is it something else entirely that they're after?
They're diverse about this. For example, Svoboda Party, which was the most important party several years ago, electorally important, they were able to get into the parliament in 2012 with 10% of the votes. And they played an important part in Euromaidan revolution as well. But in 2014, they basically lost the elections. They didn't get into the parliament. They didn't get about 0.3% they needed to get into the parliament. Nevertheless, during before Euromaidan, they were actually Eurosceptic, and they were fostering quite close relations with the National Front in France. I suppose it was called National Front at that moment, Le Pen's party. However, during the Euromaidan revolution, they kind of reinterpreted what's going on, and they started to see EU as a leverage against Russia. So if Russia is against the EU, it's our kind of natural ally. However, there are other currents that, as you mentioned, that more like, if they are pro-European, they are pro-European in very specific sense, in the sense of white Europe, and not really happy about LGBT issues in the European Union, very much repeating the discourse against so-called cultural Marxism and so on. So being more close to actual European far-right conservatives, and seeing them as the model. The problem is that many of these European far-right parties are also kind of pro-Russian. And that's creating a problem for Ukrainian nationalists, how we can ally with Orban or Salvini if they are not really if they're so friendly to Russia. That's a problem. And one of the international strategies of Azov was trying to kind of to push a part of European extreme right scene into more pro-Ukrainian position, and winning them on their side. And partially they were successful with this. However, it doesn't really change the orientation of the most electorally relevant European parties.
How did Euromaidan lead to the war in Donbass and Russia's seizure of Crimea? You write that the conflict is, quote, predominantly misrepresented as the war with Russia. How should we understand Russia's role, and how should we understand it as, first and foremost, a civil conflict?
Yeah, the timing in understanding of the events is very crucial, because when we look at which precise moment the violence started in Ukraine, it started not in Donbass, it started not in Crimea, it started on the streets of Kyiv and also in Western Ukraine in the last days of Euromaidan revolution, before Putin sent any of his green men to Crimea, before he sent or supported the pro-Russian irredentist uprising in Donbass. So the story about the war that reduces the war to the interstate conflict just simply starts too late. I don't really understand why the violence that started, specifically on February 18, 2014 in Kyiv, and which led in the very first days, the first day and first night, to deaths of from 20 to 30 protesters and up to a dozen of police, and with the use of weapons, not simply bricks or Molotov cocktails, which were used before, but actually like shooting guns and formation of the armed groups in these days, and the violent uprising in the Western Ukraine, and that this all was actually perceived by both parts of the conflict, both the government and the opposition, as civil war. They were saying this: the civil war is starting in Ukraine. We are just forgetting about this. What we know from the documents and from the interviews, public interviews, that, for example, the right sector, the radical nationalist organizations that played an important role in the violent escalation during the Maidan, they had plans for guerrilla war in Western Ukraine in case Yanukovych would be able to suppress the protests in Kiev. Andrei Parubiy, who after Maidan became the speaker of Ukrainian parliament, but had a very interesting history as a leader of the youth organization of the Social Nationalist Party of Ukraine, that later was rebranded as Svoboda Party. And he was heading the torchlight marches in Hitler-Jugend-style uniform in the 90s in Lviv, in Western Ukraine. So during Euromaidan, he was kind of like more moderate politician, although he has never rejected his far-right background. And he was also kind of like a commander of Maidan vigilantist paramilitary formations that were called self-defense. And as he is saying in the interviews, they really had a plan, kind of like a plan B. If Yanukovych defeats us in Kiev, we are moving the center of uprising to Western Ukraine, and in the last days of Euromaidan, the Western Ukrainian local government, they were proclaiming their autonomy from Kiev, and they were proclaiming that they're not following any orders from the illegitimate government anymore. And so this was the classical revolutionary situation when the revolutionaries are starting to get control over some sizable part of the territory of the state, getting some at least loosely organized armed units, or at least heading towards this. And the civil conflict has already counted quite sizable number of victims. And especially on February 20, with the notorious shooting of the protesters at the streets of Kiev, which is still not really investigated, and there's still no official conclusion. The trial is still going on for 8 years about this. And the most comprehensive study of that conflict done by Canadian political scientist Ivan Kachinovsky basically claims that this was a false flag operation by some of the opposition groups that were trying to escalate the conflict with massive bloodshed and to leave no space for any compromise with Yanukovych. So after that, he would need either to destroy the uprising with violence. However, he didn't get support from the military institutions, particularly from all of the police. And he chose basically to escape from Kiev instead of this. Or Yanukovych is doing what he actually done. He was removed. I mean, this is the indispensable part of the violent escalation that followed afterwards, because such scale of violence was unprecedented in Ukraine. It was unseen in Ukraine since perhaps late 40s, 50s, when the NKVD or KGB was destructing the remnants of the nationalist guerrilla in Western Ukraine. Afterwards, there was 2 consecutive generations of Soviet people, Ukrainians, who haven't seen any massive violence on the streets. And of course, such unprecedented levels of violence, they create polarization within the society, and they create reasons to question the new post-revolutionary government, and pushes at least some of the people in southern and eastern regions to think about separation from Ukraine, to join some anti-Maidan rallies, which were not that big as pro-Maidan. However, they also involved some kind of like pro-Russian or anti-Maidan segment of Ukrainian politics, with a quite significant number of people, and which in Donetsk and in Lugansk, they were more like radical. They were starting to assault the governmental buildings. And on April 12, the group of Igor Strelkov, former Russian FSB officer, comes with arms and starts an armed uprising with the idea that probably Russians would also try to implement the Crimean scenario, but for a wider part of Ukraine. However, Putin decided differently. Instead of annexing a bigger part of Ukraine, he was like covertly supporting this uprising, which in the end led to the stalemate in Donbass, to the Minsk agreements. So the story behind of this war is much longer, and the narrative about which reduces the war to Russia-Ukraine conflict just simply forgets how it all started.
The conflict is often represented as fundamentally about regionally based identity, but you argue that this identity politics, in reality, surprise, surprise, has a material basis. Notably, the, quote, concentration in the southern and eastern parts of Ukraine of the heavy Soviet industry dependent on the markets of Russia and other ex-USSR countries. What is this broader economic geography of Ukraine? How has that shaped the country's political divide? And then how is it that those materially based differences get expressed as a conflict over language, identity, culture?
Yeah, it's true. There is an economic basis for the conflict. There is even like a quantitative economic study that creates a very complicated mathematical model, and which shows that there were more intense fightings and more higher probability of control of specific settlements in eastern Ukraine, controlled by the separatists. And the most important factor for this was not language or identity or ethnicity, the things that are usually discussed. However, the things, for example, as the number of people who work in machine building industry, who worked primarily for Russian and other post-Soviet markets, and other heavy industry created there by the Soviet Union within the Soviet trade links, and which continued to work primarily for Russia, Belarus, and other former post-Soviet countries, and which were not really needed and competitive in the European markets. And so this is a material basis for this divide. Some of the people were thinking not so much about Russia, NATO, language, but whether they would have jobs after the free trade zone with EU would be signed, after the reorientation of Ukraine towards European markets. And we see that these industries are declining, and Donbass is now got into quite severe economic disaster. Not without the role of Russia, of course, but still, of course, the more rural part of Ukraine, which is significantly less urbanized, the western regions, they didn't have the same concerns. And for them, Europe was not so much even a civilizational choice. Those social groups which worked primarily as migrant workers in the European Union, they were like materially interested in better relations with the EU, in a visa-free regime, which allows like less bureaucratic way to work in the European Union, although maybe not so legal. The civil society, dependent on the money from the Western donors, of course, they were afraid with violent suppression of the protests, because they just would leave them without their professional careers and the source of support. But there were other parts of still like post-Soviet industrial working class. They had some other concerns, although it will still be kind of like a big simplification to look at this conflict as like workers against petty bourgeoisie and intelligentsia, because it was not like that. The trade union organizations were marginal on the both sides of the conflict. Many unorganized workers, they were participating on the both sides. When Maidan turned more violent, the liberal middle class people were less important. More important were the protesters coming from poor small towns in central and western Ukraine, and who formed perhaps the important social base for radical escalation on the Maidan. These people lived not really great lives, and they were kind of like more aspiring for more radical changes, and they've seen like violence as a possible way to have revolutionary breakthrough in their lives. So, of course, what's necessary is not really violence.
The left in Ukraine, as across much of the post-Soviet world, is rather small and marginal, and it's been that way since it first emerged during Perestroika. You write, quote, "Overall, the new government's policies have not broken with the trap of dependent development of a capitalist periphery. Sooner or later, the search for a radically alternative project of national development will be back on the agenda. Yet, the new left, as it is now, will hardly be able to respond to this demand with in-depth analysis and serious strategic proposals. The new left activists remain in the comfort zone of convenient topics of specific groups of the active public, urban initiatives, feminists, environmentalists, some labor unions. This is because they remain politically, financially, intellectually, and affectively dependent on the marginal left liberal segment of Ukraine's civil society. Moreover, uncritical acceptance of the movementist ideology, particularly among contemporary liberal and libertarian left, is counterproductive for the Ukrainian New Left. Why has the New Left been unable or unwilling to connect the dots between particular struggles into a big picture politics for Ukraine as a whole? And then what would that big picture politics for Ukraine as a whole look like, and where might it find a social base?
The reason why you actually said that the post-Soviet left was generally marginal. It really depends on how we see the left. And there is a tendency to see the left in very narrow terms as something that would be more or less similar to the Western progressive left liberal circles. And in the West, it's not simply circles, it's actually like popular parties, movements, that side of politics that doesn't really exist in post-Soviet countries. And one of the reasons is that we are trying to look and to find something similar. And there are people who try to simulate, to kind of like to play into the local, like Jeremy Corbyn's Bernie Sanders and other great figures, they're inspirational, of course, in post-Soviet countries. But the question is to which extent we really can implement the same strategies, the same rhetoric, the same organizational structures, and would it be actually productive in our societies, or would it only marginalize the new left even more? I mean, if we are not looking in this narrow perspective, the left parties that were claiming to be the left parties and were calling themselves socialists, communists, were not really marginal. Specifically in Ukraine, in the 1990s, the left parties, the Communist Party of Ukraine, the Socialist Party of Ukraine, Progressive Socialist Party of Ukraine, although that party really moved in the course of the events to kind of Russian nationalist, civilizationist, conservative position. Nevertheless, the left parties in the 90s, they were the very important political opposition. They were mobilizers of significant social economic protests. They controlled a sizable portion of Ukrainian parliament. They were capable to elect a left-wing speaker of Ukrainian parliament, Alexander Moroz, who was one of the primary opposition figures to the policies of the 1990s Ukrainian presidents, Leonid Kravchuk and Leonid Kuchma. And in 1999, Kuchma was competing primarily with the communist candidate Petro Simonenko. And in the second round, Simonenko lost to Kuchma. However, he lost with 37% of the votes. So the Communist Party was one of the most popular party until Euromaidan, and until 2002, it was the most popular party in Ukraine. And so disaffected with this and disappointed with the course of the post-Soviet collapse, many people very quickly turned back to the communists, and they voted for them as a not primarily for a vision of some brighter future, however, at least for some break to collapsing, disintegrating tendencies they were experiencing around them. So this part of the left, with origins in the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, with basically like genetic continuation from the Bolshevik Party, of course, very much transformed, very much degraded. These people, of course, not looking like Lenin or Trotsky anymore, very far from them. Unfortunately, very kind of like susceptible to various like conservative discourses, and this has always been a point of new left criticism against that look, you are allowing some racist statements in your newspapers, something about American blacks, you are homophobic, not really kind of like campaigning on the homophobic initiatives, but you could see that, not really taking the modern understanding about gender relations. And are you even any part of left anymore? But at the same time, they were clearly against the neoliberal policies. They were for the primacy of the state property. They were probably not seeing the ideal in the communist states. However, they were pointing to China particularly. Look, China has not disintegrated, and it is led by the Communist Party, and so the communists might be actually quite successful in ruling a big country. And of course, the new left was saying that it's just the same capitalism and so on and so forth. And the Western left probably know all these discussions very well. But what's probably even more important, that these parties, they were not ideal, however, kind of like organic representatives of some large group within Ukrainian and larger post-Soviet societies. And we see now, particularly, that they probably are not that, it's not probably completely done with them. we've seen that the Communist Party of Russian Federation turned into kind of like the most important opposition party in the recent elections in Russia, where even liberal, like anti-communist liberal circles, they were campaigning for the communist candidates because they were the most realistic alternative to the Putin's party candidates at the elections. So whatever we think about how nationalist, how conservative, how compromised and corrupt the post-Soviet communists, at some moment we see that there is actually some real political need in those degraded structures. So this part of the left politics was primarily repressed after the Euromaidan. The government and the parliament, they voted for the so-called decommunization laws, which not exactly banned a communist ideology. They don't say like this. However, they banned so-called propaganda of a criminal totalitarian regime, which they mean the Soviet Union, and they banned the use of Soviet symbols, the naming of the streets and cities after the Soviet officials. There was a big campaign of renaming of the streets, and it's a big story to tell. And the Romanian monuments to Lenin and other Soviet leaders were removed during the course of 2014-2015, actually without that much of popular support. And the decommunization laws were not so much demanded by Ukrainian public. In the polls, they were saying that they were not actually supporting them. But at the same time, they were not ready to defend the Communist Party, and that's another problem and another result of the weakness of this segment of the civil society. So the communists were not allowed to participate in the elections. They minimized the activity to very, very limited level, and because of quite rational reasons, it's not something unusual to get on the trial for saying something pro-Soviet in the social networks. It's not of course, it's systematic monitoring of what people say and what kind of like T-shirts they wear. But there are like real cases when people for wearing a T-shirt with a Soviet national emblem, they got into trial, or for writing or on in social networks something like Lenin lives, Lenin will live. Some young guy in Lviv gets probationary term. Or the most recent, probably extremely ridiculous case when some guy in a provincial town put a like in a social network under a picture with some Soviet symbols and slogan, something like "We are the one people," referring to that Putin's agenda. And security service found him and claimed that he, with his like, he distributed it among all of his friends, something like 160 he had, and so that was a distribution of forbidden propaganda. He was fined because he actually he agreed that he pleaded guilty, that yes, he did some wrong thing, and so he was punished not so severe as in the case if he would stay on the course. He said that he didn't know that this was a punishable crime to like some Soviet symbols in the social networks. These are like the most ridiculous, extraordinary cases, but they happen. And the new left, it's a completely different story. It's a story of being more connected to a liberal part of nationalist liberal civil society of imitating the Western discourses, symbols, agenda, and trying to bring that to Ukraine with analysis that I think that prove just false, that Ukraine follows about the same way of neoliberal transformation, and that we instead of the analyzing the specifics of vast variety of post-Soviet conflicts, we must simply translate and try to implement the analysis of the neoliberal reforms and their consequences in the West and for the post-Soviet societies. So this part of the left remained. They were not that much present. They were marginal before Maidan, but after Maidan, because they were split between supporters of Maidan and then Ukraine in the war, and anti-Maidan, and then the separatist republics on the other side of the war, and squeezing middle non-campist people. They became even more marginalized, and of course also a target of the far-right attacks, of the slandering of putting them into indiscriminate pro-Russian camp for criticizing the nationalist narratives about the war and about the recent events. And so these marginal circles, they are failing to find the significant social groups that they would be able to become kind of like organic representatives. And at the same time, they are failing to see that kind of like a new generation coming, maybe a third generation of the post-Soviet new left. The first one was politicized during Perestroika. The second one was politicized during these starting Maidan revolutions in 2000s, and activization of the societies, emergence of the new movements, not of the same scale as in the West, however, around more or less similar problems. And now the third generation that is emerging in the period of the intensified inter-imperialist struggle that feels what we've seen in the last 30 years was basically like a degradation, that nothing new has emerged on the ruins of the Soviet state. And what the Soviet actually may show us some of the progressive things that we've lost, and that may still inspire, of course not to dumbly imitate, however, to inspire as an alternative that like the generation of our parents at least, that we're a part of, and may be a basis of at least of some oppositional identity. And it's not simply an identity, it's in Ukraine, this part of the left politics is practically non-existent. However, in Russia and even in Belarus, there are like dozens of Marxist circles that are reading Marx, that are reading Lenin, that are trying to analyze the current events through Marxist perspectives, that are doing kind of quite significantly present radical left propaganda in social networks. YouTube became a very important way of disseminating radical left views. Some of the most popular YouTube channels of Russian left are gathering hundreds of thousands of viewers, and this is quite significant. And so there is a kind of like a broad part of the society that feels oppositional to the government, that feels also oppositional to the post-Soviet civil societies, and is looking for more radical alternatives. And whether they would develop into something bigger, of course, it's a matter of the future discussions. However, the presence of some organic basis for the left politics in post-Soviet societies is very underestimated, and it's important that we should stop looking at the post-Soviet left from very narrow Western perspective, looking for the similar people like us, and not seeing the people who may be actually materially interested and ideologically sympathetic to many of the very basic left ideas and the fundamentals of the left politics.
Well, Volodymyr Ishchenko, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Volodymyr Ishchenko is a research associate at the Institute of East European Studies at the Free University in Berlin. His research focuses on protests and social movements, revolutions, radical right and left politics, nationalism, and civil society. His work has been published in Post-Soviet Affairs, Globalizations, New Left Review, The Guardian, and Jacobin, and he is working on a collective book manuscript, The Maidan Uprising, Mobilization, Radicalization, and Revolution in Ukraine, 2013 to 2014. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that, but unheroic though bourgeois society is, it nevertheless needed heroism, sacrifice, terror, civil war, and national wars to bring it into being. While other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes every week. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis and recorded at WBRU in Providence. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our communications coordinators are Tamuz Frankel and Gemma Sack. Our senior advisor is Thea Real Francos. Check out our vast archives at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter at thedigradio, and please do find us wherever you get podcasts and subscribe. If it's on iTunes, please also leave us a review. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what really does that is you telling your friends about the podcast. Please do make propaganda for us, and please, last but by no means least, find us at patreon.com/thedig and make a monthly contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.